There is a diplomatic message that ended a war, not a treaty, not a peace negotiation, a threat delivered through a neutral nation to an enemy that was never supposed to know who sent it or what it contained. On March 19, 1953, President Dwight Eisenhower approved a message to be passed to China through India's Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. The message had no official document number. It was never supposed to exist in writing. The content was simple and catastrophic. If the Korean War did not end, the United States was prepared to expand the conflict, and nuclear weapons would be on the table. The Korean War had been running for 33 months. Truman had tried negotiation, he had tried military pressure, he had tried international coalition. By the time he left office in January 1953, the front lines had not moved in 18 months. 54,000 Americans were dead. The armistice talks at Panmunjom had been deadlocked for nearly 2 years over a single argument: whether prisoners of war would be forced to return home against their will. Eisenhower inherited a war with no exit. He had run his entire presidential campaign on one sentence, the sentence that won him the election: "I will go to Korea." It sounded like a promise to fix something. What nobody understood at the time was that fixing it would require a threat so extreme it could never be officially admitted. And it worked in 77 days. To understand what Eisenhower was inheriting, you need to understand what Korea looked like from inside the White House in late 1952. The war had begun on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel with Soviet equipment and Soviet training. Truman committed American forces within 72 hours. Douglas MacArthur drove the North Koreans back almost to the Chinese border. Then China entered with 300,000 men, and the war reversed completely. MacArthur wanted to bomb Chinese supply lines across the Manchurian border. Truman fired him. A president fired the most famous general in America to prevent a wider war. The political damage never healed. By mid-1951, both sides had stabilized near the original border and begun armistice negotiations. Those negotiations lasted 2 years. The key dispute: 46,000 North Korean and Chinese prisoners in American camps had said they would refuse repatriation. They did not want to go back. North Korea and China demanded their return. The United States refused to force men back to a country they were fleeing. On that single point, the war continued for 2 more years and approximately 20,000 more American deaths. When Eisenhower took office in January 1953, the briefing confirmed what he already suspected. There was no military path to victory. There was no diplomatic path both sides would accept. The only thing moving was the casualty count. He had one option left, and it was the one option that, if it became public, could trigger exactly the wider war he was trying to prevent. The plan required perfect deniability. Eisenhower could not deliver a nuclear ultimatum directly to China. The moment it became official American policy, every ally in Europe would panic. The Soviet Union would be forced to respond. The threat, if it was a threat, would detonate into a real crisis before it had a chance to work. The solution was Jawaharlal Nehru. India had positioned itself as the neutral voice of the developing world, maintaining diplomatic channels with both Washington and Beijing. That channel was the mechanism. In late May 1953, the message moved. American officials indicated to Indian intermediaries that the United States was considering removing the restrictions on its military operations in Korea. That phrase, "removing restrictions," was the diplomatic language for nuclear authorization. Nehru passed the substance to Zhou Enlai. Zhou passed it to Beijing. Beijing understood what it meant. The Chinese government had no reliable counter to American nuclear capability in 1953. The Soviet Union had tested its first nuclear device in 1949, but the logistics of extending that deterrent to a land war in Korea were untested and uncertain. China was exposed, and now China knew that the man in the White House was not Harry Truman. Subscribe now if you're still here. What happened in the next 77 days was not an accident. On July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom. The front line was almost exactly where it had been when negotiations began 2 years earlier. The prisoner dispute was resolved through voluntary repatriation. The American position intact. Eisenhower had achieved in 77 days what diplomacy alone could not deliver in 24 months. If you're still here, you already know more than the official version ever told you. What we just established, a sitting American president, ended a 3-year war, not with military force, not with diplomacy, but with a nuclear threat delivered through a neutral country. A threat so dangerous it had to be invisible to work. The armistice held. The threat was never officially confirmed during Eisenhower's lifetime. The documents that proved it existed were classified for decades. What comes next is what happened when the secret started to unravel, and why the doctrine it created still runs the world today. Eisenhower never confirmed the nuclear threat publicly. Not in his memoirs, not in interviews, not in the oral history projects that followed his presidency. He described ending the Korean War as a diplomatic achievement, full stop. The mechanism remained buried. The first serious evidence emerged in 1984, when declassified documents from the Eisenhower Presidential Library described internal NSC discussions about expanding the war and using nuclear weapons if the armistice talks failed. They referenced channels through India. The pieces were there, but the direct confirmation that the threat had been deliberately transmitted to Beijing was still missing. In 1992, more documents surfaced. Former Eisenhower administration officials confirmed in oral history interviews what the paperwork had implied. The threat had been real. The channel through Nehru had been deliberate. And it had worked precisely because it could not be traced back to a White House press conference. Think about what that means. The most consequential act of nuclear deterrence in the Cold War, the moment American nuclear capability actually stopped a war, happened in a way that required complete official silence to function. The moment it became public, its power collapsed. It worked because nobody admitted it. The doctrine Eisenhower used that week became the foundation of every nuclear deterrence strategy that followed. The idea that a threat does not need to be explicit to be real. That ambiguity is more powerful than declaration. That the most dangerous message is the one delivered quietly through a third party with nothing in writing. That doctrine is still operational today. Every nuclear-armed state on the planet runs on some version of what Eisenhower tested in 1953. The war ended. The method was buried. And 70 years later, the architecture of global deterrence still runs on the logic of a threat that was never supposed to exist.